Very good, he said, pulling her into a hug. The state attorney's office confirmed they're moving forward with charges against Brandt and his top associates. And they're expanding the investigation to include everyone implicated in the evidence we handed over. Maria exhaled, a mix of relief and satisfaction washing over her. Finally, she said, it feels like justice is catching up to him. Michael nodded. It is. And the best part, they're setting up a task force to oversee reforms in law enforcement across the state. They want me to lead it. Maria's eyes widened. Michael, that's amazing. You deserve this. He smiled, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. It's a lot of responsibility, and it's not going to be easy. There's still resistance, and we'll have to fight for every inch of progress. Maria placed a hand on his cheek, her voice steady. You're the right person for this. If anyone can lead that fight, it's you. In the days that followed, Michael accepted the role, diving headfirst into the work of rebuilding trust and integrity within the system. Maria, too, found a new purpose. She began volunteering with organizations that supported families affected by corruption and abuse of power, using her experience to advocate for change. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Michael turned to Maria. Do you ever wish we could go back to before all of this? He asked quietly. Maria thought for a moment before shaking her head. No, she said firmly, because now we know what we're capable of. We stood up to people who thought they were untouchable, and we came out stronger. I wouldn't trade that for anything. Michael smiled, pulling her close. Neither would I. As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, they sat in comfortable silence, knowing that their fight wasn't over but confident in their ability to face whatever came next. Together, they had weathered a storm that could have broken them, and together, they would continue to stand against whatever challenges lay ahead. And somewhere miles away, Brandt sat in a sterile holding cell, the power he had once wielded slipping through his fingers. He had underestimated the strength of two people who refused to be silenced, and now, for the first time, he faced the consequences of his actions. Justice had found him, and the ripples of Michael and Maria's courage were spreading far beyond what they could have imagined. The fight for accountability was far from over, but it was a fight they were no longer waging alone. Under the golden glow of the morning sun, the streets of Metro Heights buzzed with life. The city had its charm, a blend of old neighborhoods and modern skyscrapers, a place where stories unfolded daily, some uplifting, others heartbreaking. Among these streets, Officer Daniel Royce was making his morning rounds. Daniel was a veteran cop with a reputation that walked a fine line between respect and controversy. His strict demeanor had often been called out, but he chalked it up to doing his job. What wasn't so easy to dismiss, though, were the hushed whispers about his discriminatory practices. Today, Daniel was particularly agitated. Traffic was heavy, his coffee had gone cold, and the day had only just begun. He drove his squad car with an air of impatience, scanning the sidewalks for anything that might disrupt the order he so rigidly upheld. That's when he spotted him, a tall black man in a crisp suit standing at the corner, checking his phone. There was nothing unusual about him, but Daniel felt his instincts flare. It wasn't intuition, it was prejudice. Daniel slowed the car and rolled down the window. Hey, you, what are you doing around here? He barked, the authority in his voice carrying more edge than necessary. The man looked up, startled but composed. His name was Marcus Jameson, and he had just moved back to Metro Heights after years of serving in various precincts across the country. Marcus wasn't just any officer. He was a decorated law enforcement veteran with a sharp mind, steady resolve, and a newly minted title, Captain of Metro Heights Police Department. Today was supposed to be his first day on the job. He was on his way to the station, ready to introduce himself to his new team and make a positive change in a community he cared about deeply. Marcus, holding his composure, replied calmly, I'm just waiting for my ride. Is there a problem? Daniel's eyes narrowed. You seem out of place here. Let me see some ID. It wasn't a question, it was a command. Marcus's heart sank slightly, but not from fear. He'd dealt with this kind of behavior before, too many times. He pulled out his wallet and handed over his ID, silently hoping this interaction wouldn't escalate. Daniel examined the ID with a scrutinizing gaze, but didn't seem to register the name. He was too busy looking for something, anything, to justify his suspicion. "Where are you heading?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, then said, "I have a meeting at the precinct." Daniel smirked. "Oh, you've got a meeting, huh? What, you got complaints to file? Someone bothering you?" The tone was dripping with condescension, and Marcus could feel the weight of it. He decided to say nothing more, knowing from experience that escalating the conversation wouldn't help. He was just about to explain further when Daniel stepped out of the car. "Turn around," Daniel ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. "I need to check you out." "What for?" Marcus asked, his voice still calm but firm. "I haven't done anything." "Don't talk back," Daniel snapped. "Turn around now." As the situation intensified, a small crowd began to gather, murmuring among themselves. Phones came out, cameras pointed, and a palpable tension filled the air. Marcus knew he had to stay composed, but inside he was boiling. Not because of what was happening to him, it wasn't new, but because he knew this kind of behavior was a stain on the badge they both wore. Daniel grabbed Marcus's arm, his grip forceful, and before anyone could process what was happening, a punch was thrown. It landed squarely on Marcus's jaw. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Marcus stumbled, but didn't retaliate, his training kicking in. "Enough," Marcus finally said, his voice commanding and loud enough to stop Daniel mid-action. Marcus straightened his tie, ignoring the sting on his face. "Officer, I need you to look at that ID again. Carefully." Daniel, still seething, snatched the ID from his pocket and gave it a second glance. This time, his eyes caught the words he had missed earlier. * Captain Marcus Jameson, Metro Heights Police Department *. The blood drained from Daniel's face as realization hit him like a freight train. His jaw slackened, his hand trembling slightly as he lowered the ID. The crowd, still recording, buzzed with whispers. Marcus's sharp eyes locked onto Daniel's, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. "Now," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm, "would you like to explain to me what just happened?" And with that, the story had only just begun. The street fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional whisper among the bystanders. Daniel stood frozen, his grip on Marcus's ID slackening until it slipped from his hand and landed on the pavement. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The weight of his actions, coupled with the realization of who he had just struck, seemed to crush him all at once. Marcus bent down, calmly retrieving his ID. His movements were deliberate, calculated, as though he were giving Daniel a moment to process what had just occurred. The captain straightened, his expression unreadable. The sting on his jaw throbbed, but Marcus had learned long ago how to mask pain, physical or otherwise. His eyes scanned the growing crowd, noting the phones still pointed at them. This wasn't just an incident now, it was a spectacle. "You have two choices, Officer Royce," Marcus said, his voice measured but carrying an undeniable authority. "We can handle this right here, or we can take it to the precinct." Daniel's face turned a shade paler. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain some semblance of control. "Captain, I didn't realize." "That much is obvious," Marcus cut in, his tongue sharp enough to slice through Daniel's stammering. He gestured toward the squad car. "I suggest we continue this conversation somewhere more appropriate, unless you prefer to explain yourself in front of your audience." Daniel glanced at the crowd, now murmuring louder as they recorded every second. He nodded stiffly and gestured toward his car. Marcus gave him a small nod in return, signaling him to lead the way. The two men walked to the squad car, the tension between them thick enough to be palpable. Marcus got into the passenger seat without a word, while Daniel fumbled with his keys before starting the engine. The drive to the precinct was steeped in silence, except for the occasional static of the police radio. Marcus stared out the window, his mind replaying the events of the morning. This wasn't how he'd imagined his first day back in Metro Heights would begin. He'd wanted to make a strong impression, but not like this. The city had its issues, he knew that. It was part of why he'd accepted the captain's position. Yet, the stark reality of those issues was now sitting in the driver's seat next to him. Daniel, on the other hand, was grappling with a storm of emotions. Shame, fear, and defensiveness battled for dominance in his mind. He stole a glance at Marcus, who sat composed, his hands resting lightly on his knees. The punch replayed in Daniel's head, the moment he'd acted out of anger, out of prejudice. He tried to justify it to himself. It was a high-stress job. He had to make split-second decisions. But deep down, he knew those were just excuses. As they pulled into the precinct parking lot, Daniel's stomach churned. He parked the car and turned to Marcus, who was already opening the door. "Captain," Daniel began hesitantly, I need to explain." "You will," Marcus said, stepping out of the car. Inside. The precinct buzzed with activity as officers moved between desks, phones rang, and papers shuffled. As Marcus entered, the room seemed to shift. Conversations quieted, and heads turned. Some officers recognized him immediately, their eyes widening in surprise, while others simply registered the commanding presence of someone new and important. Marcus walked to the front desk, his posture straight, his expression calm but firm. "Good morning," he said to the desk sergeant. "I'm Captain Marcus Jameson. I need a private room for a discussion." The sergeant nodded quickly, his eyes flicking to Daniel, who hovered behind Marcus like a shadow. "Yes, sir. Follow me." The room they were led to was small and nondescript, with a table and a few chairs. Marcus entered first, taking the seat at the head of the table. Daniel followed reluctantly, his movements hesitant. The door closed behind them, leaving the two men alone. Marcus leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the table. For a moment, he simply looked at Daniel, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Start talking," he said finally. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Captain, I didn't know who you were. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" Marcus repeated, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "What kind of mistake, Officer Royce? Be specific." Daniel shifted in his seat, his mind racing. I thought you might have been suspicious. You were standing there, and what?" Marcus interrupted. "Checking my phone on a public street makes me suspicious. Or was it something else about me that caught your attention?" Daniel's face burned. He couldn't meet Marcus's gaze. "I didn't mean. It wasn't about that." "Wasn't it?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet but pointed. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you acted on assumptions. Dangerous ones." Daniel's fists clenched in his lap. He wanted to argue, to push back, but he knew he had no ground to stand on. "I've been under a lot of stress," he said finally, grasping at straws. "The job, it gets to you." Marcus nodded slowly. "The job is hard. That's not an excuse. Every officer here is under stress, but was still expected to uphold the law, not abuse it." Daniel's head dropped. He felt the weight of those words like a blow. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying the man before him. "This isn't just about me," he said after a pause. "What happened today could have happened to anyone, and that's the problem. This department, this city, deserves better. Do you understand that?" "Yes, sir," Daniel mumbled, barely above a whisper. Marcus stood, the chair scraping softly against the floor. "I'm not here to ruin your career, Officer Royce, but I won't ignore what happened either. There will be consequences." Daniel looked up, his expression a mix of relief and dread. Marcus opened the door, pausing before he stepped out. "And one more thing," he said, turning back to face Daniel. "Think long and hard about why you wear that badge." If you can't answer that question honestly, maybe it's time to reconsider. With that, Marcus left the room, the door clicking softly behind him. Outside, the precinct had resumed its usual rhythm, but Marcus felt the eyes of his new colleagues on him as he walked to his office. He pushed open the door, exhaling deeply as he took in the space that would now be his. Sitting at the desk, Marcus pulled out a notepad. He began jotting down notes, not just about the morning's incident, but about the department as a whole. He had a lot of work to do, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. But if today had taught him anything, it was that the change Metro Heights needed couldn't wait another day. Marcus sat in his office, his pen tapping rhythmically against the notepad as his mind churned. The precinct's atmosphere buzzed outside his door, a steady flow of voices, phones, and footsteps. He'd worked in departments like this before, places where the uniform came with unspoken rules about power and privilege. But Metro Heights felt different. It wasn't just the morning's incident with Officer Royce. It was the way the entire department had paused when he walked in, as if the very idea of accountability had caught them off guard. He leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the walls adorned with commendations from his years of service. They felt distant, reminders of victories in battles that hadn't won the war. He'd taken this job for a reason, to confront the rot he knew existed in law enforcement, to prove it could be better. But moments like this made the weight of the task feel overwhelming. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, straightening in his seat. The door opened to reveal Detective Elena Morales. She was in her late 30s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, with a reputation for being one of the most reliable detectives in the precinct. She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. "Captain," she said, her tone respectful but direct. "Word travels fast around here. I heard about what happened with Royce." Marcus motioned for her to sit. "And what's the word?" Elena hesitated before sitting across from him. "Mixed, honestly. Some of the officers think he's in deep trouble, but others, well, they're saying you might have provoked him." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Provoked him? By existing in a public space?" Elena gave him a look that said she didn't agree with it, but wasn't surprised. "You know how it is. Some of them are already feeling threatened by having a new captain, especially one who's, let's say, not their usual." Marcus nodded, understanding the implication. "And you? What do you think?" "I think Royce messed up," Elena said bluntly. "But I also think he's not the only one around here who has that kind of attitude. If you want to clean this place up, you're going to need more than a reprimand. You'll need allies." Marcus studied her for a moment. There was a sincerity in her tone, a quiet determination. "Are you offering to be one?" he asked. She smirked. "Depends. Are you serious about fixing this place, or are you just here to look good for the brass?" Marcus leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I'm here to make a difference, but I'm not naive enough to think I can do it alone." Elena nodded, her smirk fading into a more serious expression. "Then you've got me. But fair warning, Captain. This department has roots. Deep ones. Some of the officers here have been on the force longer than I've been alive. They've got connections, and they don't take kindly to change." Marcus let her words settle, his mind already racing with plans. "Good to know. Anything else I should be aware of?" Elena hesitated again, her eyes flicking to the door as if to make sure it was still closed. "There's something else. A case. It's been sitting cold for months, and no one's willing to touch it. Too messy, too political." "What kind of case?" Marcus asked, his interest piqued. "A shooting," she said, lowering her voice. "Young black man, unarmed, gunned down by an off-duty cop. The officer claimed self-defense, but the evidence, let's just say it doesn't add up. The family's been demanding justice, but the higher-ups keep stalling." Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. "And the officer? Are they still on the force?" Elena nodded grimly. "Still wearing the badge, still patrolling the streets." Marcus exhaled slowly, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Why hasn't this been dealt with? Because it's easier not to, Elena said simply. The department doesn't want the backlash. And honestly, some people here think the kid got what he deserved. The anger that simmered beneath Marcus's calm exterior flared. He clenched his fists, then forced himself to relax. Send me everything you have on the case, he said finally. If no one else is willing to touch it, I will. Elena nodded, standing. I'll get it to you by the end of the day. But be careful, Captain. Taking this on won't just put you in the spotlight, it'll put a target on your back. Marcus watched her leave, the door clicking shut behind her. He stared at the notepad on his desk, the blank page suddenly feeling heavier than it should. He had known this job would come with challenges, but the layers of corruption and complacency were already deeper than he'd anticipated. Outside, the precinct hummed along, oblivious to the storm brewing in Marcus's office. But not everyone was unaware. Daniel Royce sat at his desk, his hands gripping the edge as he stared blankly at the paperwork in front of him. He couldn't shake the image of Marcus's face when he'd realized who he was. The calm authority, the piercing eyes. It was a look that made Daniel feel exposed, seen in a way he wasn't used to. Across the room, another officer leaned over. Officer Todd Brazen was one of Royce's closest allies, a man who shared many of his views but was better at hiding them. What's the deal with the new captain? Brazen asked, keeping his voice low. Royce shook his head. He's trouble, that's for sure. Brazen smirked. Well, maybe trouble needs a reminder of how things work around here. Royce didn't respond, but his silence was enough to keep the conversation alive. Brazen patted him on the shoulder. Don't sweat it. He'll either fall in line or get out of the way. They always do. But Marcus Jameson wasn't like the others, and as the precinct buzzed on, the quiet tension in the air hinted at the battle ahead, one that would test loyalty, expose secrets, and force everyone to decide which side of history they wanted to stand on. The precinct seemed quieter than usual in the days that followed, though the tension was unmistakable. Marcus moved through the halls with a purposeful stride, but he could feel the weight of watchful eyes on his back. Officers whispered in corners, conversations stopped as he passed, and the unease grew thicker with every hour. It wasn't paranoia. Marcus knew that shaking up the status quo would ruffle feathers. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly the resistance would surface. True to her word, Elena had sent over the files on the cold case. Marcus spent late nights poring over the details, each page painting a grim picture. The victim, Jamal Reed, was only 22 years old, a college student with no criminal record. He'd been walking home from a friend's house when the off-duty officer, Kyle Mercer, had confronted him. Mercer claimed Jamal had acted aggressively, but witness statements and forensic evidence told a different story. Jamal had been unarmed, his hands up when the fatal shot was fired. The case had all the hallmarks of a cover-up: misplaced evidence, conflicting testimonies, and a department that seemed eager to sweep it under the rug. Marcus couldn't let it go. Every detail gnawed at him, every unanswered question fueling his determination. He knew taking on this case would escalate tensions, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. One evening, as the city outside began to settle into darkness, Marcus summoned Elena to his office. She arrived quickly, a folder tucked under her arm. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, closing the door behind her. Marcus gestured for her to sit. "I've gone through everything you sent me," he said, "but I need more. Specifically, I need to know about Kyle Mercer. Who's protecting him?" Elena's expression darkened. "That's a long list," she admitted. "Mercer's been on the force for over a decade. He's got friends in high places, people who'll go out of their way to keep him untouchable." "Anyone in this precinct?" Marcus asked. Elena hesitated, then nodded. "A few. Royce is one of them. Grayson too. They run in the same circles. There's a network, Captain, and it's not just about loyalty, it's about power." Marcus exhaled slowly, the pieces clicking into place. He wasn't just up against a single officer or a bad policy. He was facing a deeply entrenched culture. "If we're going to take this case forward," he said, I need to know who I can trust. Elena leaned forward, lowering her voice. Not many, to be honest. But there are a few of us who want to see things change. You've got me, for starters. And Officer Patel, he's young. But he's sharp, and he doesn't buy into the old boys club. Sergeant Rivera might be an ally too, but she's careful. She won't stick her neck out unless she's sure it'll make a difference. Marcus nodded, making mental notes. Then we start with what we have. I'll handle Mercer. You focus on gathering anything else we can use. Witnesses, reports, anything that strengthens our case. Elena stood, her determination clear. I'm on it. But Captain, be careful. If Mercer and his crew feel cornered, they won't play fair. I wouldn't expect them to, Marcus said. But I'm not here to play fair either. I'm here to set things right. As Elena left, Marcus leaned back in his chair, the weight of the task ahead pressing down on him. He knew the risks, but backing down wasn't an option. This wasn't just about Jamal Reed. It was about the kind of department he wanted to lead, the kind of legacy he wanted to leave. The next day, Marcus called a department-wide meeting. Officers shuffled into the precinct's main conference room, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Royce and Grayson sat near the back, their postures stiff, while Elena took a seat near the front. Marcus stood at the podium, his presence commanding. Good morning, he began, his voice steady. I won't take up too much of your time, but there are a few things we need to address. He paused, scanning the room. First, I want to make something clear. This department has a responsibility to this community and to each other. That responsibility means holding ourselves to the highest standards, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. A murmur rippled through the room, but Marcus pressed on. I know change isn't easy, and I know not everyone here agrees with my approach. But let me be clear. We will be a department that earns the trust of the people we serve. That starts with accountability. His words hung in the air, the tension in the room palpable. Royce exchanged a glance with Grayson, his jaw tight. Marcus could feel the resistance, but he refused to back down. There's one more thing, Marcus said. Effective immediately, the case of Jamal Reed is being reopened. I'll be leading the investigation personally. The room erupted in whispers, some officers visibly shifting in their seats. Royce's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists. Grayson leaned toward him, whispering something Marcus couldn't hear. I know this decision won't sit well with everyone, Marcus continued, his voice cutting through the noise. But justice doesn't have an expiration date. This case deserves answers, and Jamal Reed's family deserves the truth. The murmurs quieted, but the tension remained. Marcus stepped away from the podium, signaling the end of the meeting. Officers began to file out, some avoiding his gaze, others throwing him defiant looks. Royce and Grayson lingered, their expressions hard, before eventually leaving. As the room emptied, Marcus caught Elena's eye. She nodded subtly, a silent show of support. He knew the days ahead would be some of the hardest of his career, but as he stood in the now empty room, the weight of the department pressing down on him, Marcus felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The precinct buzzed with a strange energy after the meeting. Officers moved through their routines with forced focus, the usual chatter replaced by quiet exchanges and stolen glances. The reopening of the Jamal Reed case had sent ripples through the department, and it didn't take long for those ripples to reach beyond the walls of Metro Heights. That evening, Marcus stayed late in his office, reviewing more files and piecing together the timeline of events. He was determined to understand every angle of the case before making his next move. His desk was strewn with crime scene photos, autopsy reports, and witness statements, each detail painting a clearer picture of what had happened that night. But as he sifted through the documents, something gnawed at him, a missing piece, a question unanswered. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Marcus looked up to see Officer Patel standing hesitantly in the doorway. The young officer shifted nervously but stepped inside when Marcus motioned for him. Captain, Patel began, his voice low. I thought you should see this. He placed a flash drive on the desk. Marcus picked it up, his brow furrowing. What's on it? He asked. Elena hesitated. Are you sure? Once this footage goes public, it's going to blow everything wide open. The department, Mercer, his allies, they won't go down without a fight. I'm sure, Marcus said, his voice steady. The truth is bigger than the risk. Jamal's family deserves justice, and this department needs to face its demons. They worked quickly, preparing the footage to share with the city's independent oversight board. Marcus knew this was the only way to ensure the evidence wouldn't get buried again. As they finalized their plans, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was Patel. Captain, Patel said, his voice urgent. You need to get down to the garage, now. Marcus and Elena exchanged a glance before heading down together. When they arrived, they found Patel standing next to Marcus's car, pointing at something on the hood. A single piece of paper was taped there, the words scrawled in thick, angry letters. Drop it, or else. Helena's face hardened. This is intimidation, plain and simple. Marcus stared at the note, his jaw tightening. They're trying to scare us off. It won't work. Patel stepped closer, lowering his voice. Captain, I've heard whispers. Royce and Grayson, they're planning something big. They know the footage exists, and they're panicking. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the garage. They turned to see Royce and Grayson walking toward them, their expressions dark. Captain, Royce said, his tone mocking. Looks like you've been busy. Marcus stepped forward, meeting Royce's gaze. You're out of line, officer. Royce smirked. Am I? Because from where I stand, it looks like you're tearing this department apart. All for what? A dead kid and some headlines. The words hit like a slap, but Marcus didn't flinch. This isn't about headlines, he said coldly. It's about accountability, something you seem to have a problem with. Grayson took a step closer, his voice low and threatening. You're playing a dangerous game, Captain. You might want to think twice before you get in over your head. Marcus held his ground. Is that a threat? Take it however you want, Grayson replied. Elena stepped beside Marcus, her eyes blazing. You two should leave. Now. Royce and Grayson exchanged a look before retreating, their postures stiff with anger. As they disappeared up the stairs, Marcus turned to Patel and Elena. We need to move fast. They're running out of time, and that makes them dangerous. They returned to Marcus' office to finalize their submission to the oversight board, but just as they hit send, the power in the precinct flickered and went out. The hum of computers and fluorescent lights was replaced by an eerie silence. What the hell? Elena muttered, grabbing her phone to use as a flashlight. Marcus's phone buzzed again. It was a message from an unknown number. You should have listened. A chill ran down his spine, but he forced himself to stay calm. We're not stopping, he said firmly. Let's go. With the submission sent, the three of them left the precinct, sticking together as they made their way to Marcus's car. The streets outside were quiet, the city's usual buzz muted under the weight of what they'd just done. As they drove toward the oversight board's office, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. He checked the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of a black SUV that seemed to be tailing them. Hold on, he said, tightening his grip on the wheel. Elena turned in her seat, her eyes narrowing. They're following us. Patel reached for his radio, but Marcus stopped him. No, if they know we're onto them, they might escalate. We'll lose them first. He took a sharp turn, weaving through the streets in an attempt to shake the SUV, but it stayed on their tail, the tension in the car mounting with every second. Finally, Marcus pulled into a crowded parking lot, maneuvering between cars until they were out of sight. They waited, holding their breaths as the SUV sped past. That was too close, Patel said, his voice shaky. Marcus nodded. But we're not stopping. Let's go. They reached the oversight board's office without further incident, delivering the footage into secure hands. As they left the building, Marcus finally allowed himself to exhale. The evidence was safe, and the wheels of justice were in motion. But just as they stepped outside, Marcus's phone buzzed again. Another message, this time with a video attachment. He'd opened it, his heart sinking as he watched. The grainy footage showed Patel in the precinct's server room, clearly accessing the Bodicom files. The message below read, "Your team isn't as clean as you think. How long before this comes back on you?" Elena looked over his shoulder, her face pale. "They're not done, Captain. They're coming for all of us." Marcus closed his phone, his jaw tightening. "Let them come," he said. "We're ready." The morning after the evidence was submitted, the city woke up to a storm of breaking news. Every major outlet was running the story: a police captain reopening a controversial case, Bodicom footage proving a cover-up, and the shadowy threats against those seeking justice. The footage of Jamal Reed's final moments played on repeat across networks, sparking outrage and grief. Protests erupted throughout the city, people demanding accountability, not just for Officer Mercer, but for the entire culture of corruption that had allowed such a tragedy to happen. Marcus sat in his office, the weight of everything finally catching up to him. The precinct was quieter than usual. Some officers called out, unwilling to face the public scrutiny, while others kept their heads down, clearly rattled. Marcus knew this was just the beginning. Justice wasn't a single moment, it was a long, grueling process. Elena walked in, holding a cup of coffee and a stack of papers. "You've seen the news?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "Hard to miss. How's Patel holding up?" "He's scared," Elena admitted, setting the coffee on his desk. "But he's not backing down. He knows what he did was right." Marcus took a sip, letting the warmth steady his nerves. "We're all in this now, no turning back." Later that afternoon, Marcus received a call from the mayor's office. The oversight board had acted swiftly, announcing an independent investigation into the department. Officer Mercer was placed on unpaid leave, pending criminal charges, and several others, including Royce and Grayson, were being questioned about their roles in covering up the truth. The mayor expressed support for Marcus, but warned him to be careful. "You've shaken a hornet's nest, Captain. Stay vigilant." As the days turned into weeks, the fallout spread. Royce and Grayson both resigned under pressure, though rumors suggested they were trying to cut deals to save themselves. Patel's whistleblower role came to light, earning him both praise and scorn. He decided to transfer to another precinct, needing distance from the chaos, but he left with Marcus's promise that his bravery wouldn't be forgotten. One evening, Marcus visited Jamal Reed's mother, Mrs. Evelyn Reed. She lived in a modest house on the edge of town, its walls adorned with photos of her family. When she opened the door, her expression softened into something between gratitude and exhaustion. "Captain Johnson," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I wasn't sure I'd see this day." Marcus sat with her at the kitchen table, the scent of freshly brewed tea filling the room. "Mrs. Reed, I can't undo what happened to Jamal, but I want you to know that his story won't be buried anymore. People are listening now." Her eyes glistened with tears, but she smiled faintly. "He was a good boy, you know. Always helping people, always smiling. He didn't deserve this." "No, he didn't," Marcus agreed, his voice steady. "And I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to make sure no one else goes through what your family has." Mrs. Reed reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "Thank you. For fighting for him. For all of us." Back at the precinct, the atmosphere slowly began to change. The scrutiny from the investigation forced a reckoning, and new policies were implemented to ensure transparency and accountability. Marcus knew it wasn't enough. Real change would take years, and it required the commitment of everyone in the department. But it was a start. One evening, as Marcus prepared to leave, he noticed a group of younger officers gathered in the break room, discussing the case. They spoke with conviction, questioning old norms and expressing a desire to do better. It gave Marcus a glimmer of hope. Elena caught up with him as he headed to the parking lot. "You're staying late again," she teased. Marcus chuckled. "Old habits." She fell into step beside him. "You did good, Marcus. This isn't the end, but it's a step in the right direction." He nodded, looking up at the city's skyline, its lights twinkling against the dark sky. "We still have a long way to go," he said. "But yeah, it feels like a start." The next morning, Marcus received an unexpected call. It was from the district attorney, who wanted him to testify as part of the case against Mercer. Marcus agreed without hesitation. This wasn't just about Jamal anymore. It was about rebuilding trust, about proving that the system could hold itself accountable, even when it hurt.